Okay, hello everyone. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take you through the key features of Stephen Lee's essay, How Have Historians Assessed Nazi Economic Policy Between 1933 and 1939. What he does is basically he identifies three assumptions from the old school of historians, and just pulling back so I can demonstrate that this is the first assumption you're looking at here. And what he basically does is he shows the sort of pendulum approach, how one, in the 1950s, there was the original argument, and then that moved to more recent interpretations in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, a sort of counter-argument that challenges the old assumption, and then the pendulum has swung back most recently to sort of challenge the counter-argument, to sort of present, almost to return to the old point of view. So we'll move into the first assumption here then. And the first assumption was that the Nazi economy was a major innovation. It was very, very innovative. Now, the original, that it was a break from the past. That when Hitler came to power in 1933, he steered the economy in a completely different direction from the way the economy had been run in the Weimar Republic. Now, obviously, the argument there was that the Nazi economy was very sort of like tightly controlled. It was a dictatorship. It was run from the centre, whereas the Weimar Republic was effectively a hands-off economy. It was a capitalist economy. The government allowed market forces to run the economy with minimum interference by the government. Now, moving into the more recent interpretations, they of course have challenged that and said, well, actually, it's not that simple. Okay, and pretty much all historians now recognise that there are definite similarities between the Nazi era and the Weimar Republic. Key ones are Brüning's policies in 1930-32 were a lot more similar to the Nazi policy than previously thought. I mean, he introduced currency reform, he introduced trade restrictions. Of course, he was very much motivated by addressing the problems of the Great Depression. And he was known as the Hunger Chancellor, strict restrictions on government spending on the economy as a way of controlling it. So in a sense, all of those policies prepared the way for Schacht's new plan. There was continuity there. The previous Chancellor, Schleicher, of course, also drew up all the plans for public work programmes, the autobahns and so on. So Schacht just literally picked up those plans. Another similarity, of course, or another continuity, of course, is that Hitler, in a sense, was able to benefit from Brüning's measures. That Brüning fell, he was kicked out of power before his policies had time to reap rewards, but in effect they did. And when Hitler took power, the economy began to upturn, and it was not so much because of Schacht's policies, but because Schacht was able to sort of ride the wave of what Brüning had done. Most recent interpretations have sort of now gone back a little bit. They've said, look, the continuity argument has been over-egged. And Nazi economic policy marks a distinctive break. In particular, they've emphasised, look, under the Nazis, there were these incredibly strict controls over labour. Wages were restricted, living conditions were held down, lack of consumer goods. And although Brüning was a Hunger Chancellor and he introduced controls, his controls were more introduced by sort of like limiting expenditure, whereas the Nazi control was very much sort of like totalitarian. It was very much police control. Effectively, this is the law, and you will be arrested if you don't actually follow the law. So the leaders of the economy had no choice but to repress wages and so on and so forth. Brüning never envisaged breaking free of other economies as well, whereas the Nazis were very committed in the long term to autarky and self-sufficiency, whereas Brüning only ever saw that as a short-term measure. Okay, so moving on to the second assumption. This one is really useful for you for your section B for the efficiency argument, because it is about efficiency, so really make sure you pick up on this one. The old argument, the original argument, was that the Nazi regime was very, very efficient. Okay, quite a simplistic viewpoint written by historians in the 1950s. And again, you can sort of see the evidence here. Resources were carefully targeted at the regime's priority, which was rearmament. Schacht's new plan was stage one. It laid a basis for rearmament. With price controls, etc., etc. And then Goering's four-year plan was introduced in 1936, which logically followed on from Schacht's new plan. So it was all joined up dots, joined up thinking, all part of the process of transforming Germany into a ruthlessly efficient totalitarian state. Now, more recent interpretations, moving into the counter-argument, and you can see the names of key historians there, such as Kitchen, have very much emphasised the inefficiency of Nazi economic management. Now, the sort of chaos theory. And there's two sort of points of view here. They all come from this sort of chaos theory, but it's the reasons for the chaos. One group of historians would argue that Hitler still remained in control in spite of the chaos. A good example of that is in 1939 there was economic chaos, but Hitler nevertheless controlled it by making a decision to do some short stop wars called Blitzkrieg, rather than fighting a big war at once, to take on one country at a time using stockpiled raw materials, stockpiled weapons. Which was a way of sort of like managing the fact that the economy was not fully prepared for war. We'll look at that more when I do a podcast on the next essay. Other historians argue that the chaos was not intentional and that it's evidence of Hitler's weakness. And these historians very much emphasise, and the good phrases here: multi-layering of agencies, lack of clear delineation. So you've got lots of competing organisations. Hitler created new positions, and it created chaos. So, for example, in 1935, Hitler created a new civilian position, the plenipotentiary for the war economy. That came into conflict with the War Ministry. Then in 1936, Hitler created another new office, the Office of the Four-Year Plan, which came into conflict with the plenipotentiary for the war economy and the war ministries. And the various people involved in these offices, so Funk, the Minister of Economics, and Schacht, who was replaced by Funk, and of course Goering, all came into conflict with each other. Now, the most recent interpretations have kind of like looked at that and said, look, the chaos has been over-egged, it's been overstated. Hayes, for example, puts a lot more emphasis on the fact that in the end, solutions did emerge, that the chaos, that sort of social Darwinism, always moved towards a solution. So in a sense, it was chaos that served the purpose of efficiency. And then Adam Tooze, in his book, very much criticises that and presents a lot of convincing evidence that the economic administration was surprisingly well run. And there's a good quote which you can use there from Tooze. Moving into the third assumption, again, the original argument was that the Nazi economy was very successful. So this kind of like almost ties in with the efficiency argument, that it was an efficient economy that really achieved its objectives. And obvious examples of that: one, unemployment. There were 5.6 million people out of work in 1932, and it had dropped to 119,000. Other examples. Wages and prices were stabilised. So you can quote an old school historian, Guilbord, who emphasises that. Others have argued that it was a good example of Keynesian policy in action. In particular, the new plan was classic Keynesian economics, spending money the government didn't have as a way of kick-starting the economy and getting it moving again. Now, more recent interpretations, so moving down, more recent interpretations have obviously challenged that and really emphasised the fact that by 1939 the economy was in a state of crisis, and in particular they focused in on the fact that solving unemployment created a labour shortage. And what was happening by 1939 is there was a serious risk of inflation. If you think it through, it's fairly obvious that if employers, businessmen who need to recruit workers, there's no workers out there because you've got full employment. So what they will do is they will raise wages to attract new workers. If they have to raise wages, they've got to raise their prices of their goods to cover their costs. So there was a risk of an inflationary spiral happening in 1939, and that in a sense was one sort of crisis that was building up for Hitler. Another crisis that was building up is that all these wage controls, trying to keep wages down, and the fact that there was lack of consumer goods because of the drive for rearmament, and or obviously longer working hours, that effectively the workers were really, really unhappy. So what you've got is unhappy workers and unhappy bosses. And the only way out of that was effectively to conquer other countries as a way of sort of taking the heat out of an overheating economy. So Hitler's hand was sort of forced, and obviously, the decline in exports as well was an issue. So the most recent interpretations now have, in a sense, likewise the pendulum has sort of swung back to the beginning, that actually don't over-egg the argument that the economy was in a state of crisis. And the key historians who do that are one, Overy, and there's a nice little quote which you could use there. A lot of historians say, look, pull back and look at the big picture in comparison to the unemployment of 1929 to 32, the Great Depression. Yeah, there was an economic crisis building up in 1939, but relatively speaking, it was quite healthy. Jumping down to the bottom there, Tooze does a similar thing. He kind of like reviews and says, look, the German economy, we mustn't forget that Germany was actually a third-rate economy in 1933. In the bigger picture, it's been overstated how strong the German economy was even before Hitler came to power. Actually, Germany's economy was one of the weakest economies in Europe, and so therefore, in terms of what Hitler accomplished by 1939, although there were problems in 1939, we've got to look at it in the bigger picture that actually he achieved a lot. So those are all examples. Another point that's developed here is that, you can say there were problems arising in 1939, but for each of those problems, the Nazis had a solution. So, for example, there was a worker shortage problem. It was difficult for employers to recruit new workers, but the way the Nazis dealt with it was they imported foreign workers from the countries that they were occupying. So, for example, Austria, and then Czechoslovakia, and then Poland. And yes, there were trade imbalances. The German producers were finding it difficult to export because of the shifting priorities and the fact that the foreign exchange was being controlled. But nevertheless, those problems were offset by those bilateral trade treaties with the Balkans. So those are all sort of key issues that were explored in that essay by Stephen Lee. Hopefully you found that helpful. Remember to use the Quizlet that I've created so you can test your knowledge and understanding of this particular topic. Okay, thank you.